Welcome to Conversations with Life. This is season 3. We're talking about all things archetype and myth, and today, particularly, we're going to talk about sort of the cosmic gorilla in the room, and that is, what is God? And on a meaning journey, you have to hit this, So, people ask me all the time, do you believe in God? And I find myself saying different things every time. Sometimes like, maybe. Hell no. Yes, sometimes. Undoubtedly. And all those things are true for me. And it's really interesting because I don't consider myself an atheist. I'm a sort of theist. But I'm not even in the ballpark. So I want to, the question's not really even relevant. And so I want to just ask you guys, what do you think God is? So, Keith, what is God to you? Is there a God? And I think this is one of the basic questions that every human has to kind of work with over and over again.
I don't know. I want to say just coming out of, but in the reality, in the midst of spiritual deconstruction right now. And I, honest to God, don't know. I grew up Catholic, was an altar boy, read in church every Sunday, the whole thing, and then was agnostic for a long time, firmly agnostic, which is a weird stance to be in by itself, right? Mm-hmm. And then
firmly agnostic.
Yeah.
I am so undecided.
I am sure of my undecidedness. Yes,
so
exactly.
Sure I'm undecided.
And then,
and now you're undecided about your undecided?
Well, I was 10 years LDS and did the whole thing and served every goddamn calling you can serve, and some of them were damned, right? I was a teacher's quorum teacher. I was the Sunday school president. I was a freaking stake auditor. I was everything. I was fully in. I jumped in, both feet. And now I know I'm not that. And I know that I don't know. But I also, I'm in the phase where I'm just coming out of, I don't care.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. There's I don't know and there's I don't care. And they're definitely different flavors of agnosticism.
Yeah. And so, I'd say divorce happens and I see the effects of culture on religion in Utah, where your support system evaporates, right? And I was like, man, fuck you, fuck this. I hate all of this. This is all bullshit. And then that turned into, I don't know if there's anything there, but I also don't give a shit. It doesn't matter to me. And literally the last maybe week or so, I'm sitting here thinking I guess I care. There are people I love, and so I care what happens. But I when you're like, what is God? I'm like, fuck knows. Anyway.
Yeah, I would have to give a pretty resounding, I don't know. And, I've even heard, you can't ever really know what God is, but you keep finding out what it's not. I feel like I'm real deep in that exploration, and it is not, in my experience, the humanized, personified personality thing that I grew up believing in and making promises and covenants with, and also, I had a kind of, maybe you would call it agnostic phase where I just really wasn't willing to buy anything, but I was also willing to try anything. So I played around with a lot of different mythologies and magics and energies, and I got to a point where I was like, if this is just my imagination, that's pretty cool, and I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Because there is something that I experience that feels like a larger energy than something I could actually comprehend. And it seems to be interacting with me. But I don't really go beyond that other than from a very skeptical place. So I'll play with, I did a whole, Lakshmi thing, especially the Hindu gods. I don't know why I can get behind those better than others, but I think part of it is because built into their system is these are actually aspects of yourself that you just need to learn to understand and integrate, right? So I have a Lakshmi statue in my room and I make offerings to it sometimes, and it's funny to me, like there's a little cup of honey because somebody said Lakshmi likes honey, but there's also something there's something going on there. I just don't understand it, and so I play with it.
See, I went, like, when I went from Catholic to agnostic, I followed the idea of I'd rather believe that there is something and be wrong than believe there is nothing and be right. And so if I believe there's something, I'll be the best version of myself I can be, even if it's just because that there's a carrot and a stick, right? And so then if I'm wrong, no harm, no foul. I'm dead and nothing matters, right? Yeah. But then if I believe that there's nothing and I act the fool and do whatever the hell I want, and, this is back when I was morality tied to spirituality, I think more than is healthy. If I believe there's nothing and act stupid, and then I get there and there is nothing, my life that I've lived is still not as cool as it could have been. Like I wasted some stuff. And then if I'm wrong and I go to heaven and I've been a dumbass and believe nothing existed, I'm really going to be kicking myself. So the only situation where I have no regrets long term in my mind was, just live like there's something.
Act as if there's a something, and there's a something, and there's something to it. And kind of my thought is, therefore there's something. Carl Jung was famously asked if he believes in God, and he said, I don't believe, I know. And so, some theists look at that and say, well, look, here's this really smart guy that's a theist. He believes in God. So that proves, that something, that means something to them. Yeah. But if you really get into Carl, he's saying what he thinks is God is just that we're here. This existence, this conscious, especially this conscious existence, is God, which is a really interesting thing. And one of my things that keeps me calling myself a theist, I guess, is that I look out and my logic is pretty simple. There is something and not nothing. So there's something driving an organizational force. There's all the matter that comes together. When I look out at the world, I see entropy and I say things fall apart. But that's not all they do. They come together. Right. I came together. I happened. I'm thinking about myself right now and about the world, and that's pretty fucking miraculous. This is not a mistake. That seems pretty damn clear to me. Otherwise, there'd be nothing. If it was just chaos with no sense, and all of a sudden, there's planets and and sea otters. I don't know why sea otters.
Well, I mean, equally, those things would cease to exist at the same the same probability. If it was chaos, it would be like they're there, they're not there. It's like there's I exist. I think therefore there's got to be some kind of creative force. And I it's so funny how people can straight face tell you, I believe in God. By the way, he looks exactly like me. He's my culture and my race. What was it? There was great white God. Oh my God. Someone was like, there were no gay people in the Bible. And then the response to that person was, there weren't any white people either. I was just like, fuck yeah.
Yeah, I saw a similar thing about biblical marriage that was pretty funny.
Yeah. There have been, I think I heard somewhere, I don't know, I'm going to just throw this number out there, you can research or whatever. I heard there was like 96% of the world population total, if you tried to keep track, right, has believed in God. From ancient times to modern times. And that's age of faith, age of reason, all these different things. Sometimes the elite don't have a strong belief, but the people generally, 90% of them believe in God. I think even right now, I think maybe it's 80 something. If you just worldwide took a poll, how many people believe in God? A lot. Like most for all of history have believed in some kind of God. Yet they, there's been 260,000 some odd gods. And people look at you and say, well, mine is obviously the real one.
Yeah. Who was it? Ricky Gervais? Have you ever heard his
or mine's
his
the most
reason?
important or whatever,
His reasoning for being atheist.
Yeah.
And he talks to, I can't remember who he's talking to. It's a late night talk show host. And they're arguing back and forth about being atheist and non-atheist. And Ricky Gervais is like, there are 260,000 something odd gods that have ever existed. How many do you believe in?
Yeah.
And he's like, you don't believe in 259,999.
Yeah.
I just don't believe in one more than you. And that's atheism. And I was like, well, shit, Ricky.
It's so funny. I like
a very
Ricky
practical
Gervais.
approach. But I look at it and I'm like, okay, because the other argument for that is that natural force exists and that evolution and atoms bonding together and all those, like the scientific explanation of the world. But the science still, to me, like, I don't know, and I'm an English teacher from Australia, so I don't have the answer to this, but like, to me, I'm still looking for science to explain consciousness and science to explain thought in a way that makes sense. Like, it's electricity firing. I'm like, cool. Like, so is a computer. But
yeah, they always get to a point where there's a question mark.
Yeah,
in science, and that's, to me, maybe that's God.
Well, that's what I was gonna say, and like even if you think about the collective consciousness that we've been talking about, right? Like, there are trends in human society that defy explanation. There are cultures that all believe similar things, despite the fact that they're completely different, environments or whatever. And the argument for that is the origin culture, like that we all evolved out of Africa and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a common root and all those things. But there are just too many weird connections to not go with the idea of, okay, there might be some kind of like combined consciousness. And if that's as far as you get, you can label that God and be done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In a way, we all know God very intimately. There's something that is in us that's God in a way.
Right. I mean, if we look at consciousness as, consciousness is out there trying to meet itself and we're all little tentacles. When we go back to the octopus analogy, then we're just a tentacle of God, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Alan Watts talks about the eyeball that's trying to see itself. Like, good luck, eyeball. Yeah. I mean, you could look in a mirror, but that's kind of not.
Well, then you're not looking at yourself. You're looking at a reflection of yourself.
Yeah, you're not really. All you can really find is the illusion, or some kind of reflection, and so it's really impossible when science goes to study itself. I read this fun paper where it's like, basically it's like science admits that it can't study itself objectively.
Yeah, whenever you observe something, you change its behavior or whatever it is. Like, on a molecular level, somehow they know that when you observe
just looking at something changes it.
I'm like, that's crazy. Yeah. How do you know that's true?
Well, the point
Did you look when you weren't looking?
Yeah, the point is when consciousness is, so one of the kind of like edge ideas in science is that everything is consciousness. Mm-hmm. Like every piece of matter, on down to the smallest, on up to the biggest, is somewhat conscious, right? There's consciousness involved, or is even part and parcel of it. Yeah. And because it acts irrationally sometimes, and or what we think of as irrationally, or I would call it even super rationally, these things are happening in ways we can't even begin to understand. But this whole, that consciousness looking at itself always affects itself. Therefore, you can't really, objectivity doesn't actually exist. You can't get there. It's like the thing where you get half. You'll
never get to nothing.
You'll never get to nothing. You'll never get to the place where you're actually seeing it. Now, but we can try. And I think most systems of religion are an attempt to make sense of the sense that we have that there's more.
Well, and you could even say science is the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, science is like, it's all part of that conversation, right? Everything trying to talk to itself.
Yeah.
You know, and science is just man trying to talk to God, really.
Yeah. So when I see those signs that are like, love is love, science is real, that one always throws me off, because I feel like science is a religion, just like everything else, that has its biases and corruptions and dogmas that are just full of shit. So I think science is cool. Like, there's cool stuff there, just like I think Hinduism is cool, but I wouldn't necessarily put one above the other, because there are really, what we're trying to do is measure an experience that's not measurable and talk about something that's not, that's ineffable.
Yeah. And I think, we get stuck on the idea of science is based in fact and religion's based in faith. And I'm like, the basis of science are hypotheses, man. Like, that's theories. Like, that's what you start with. Like, have you taken an 8th grade science class? You start with the hypothesis, right? Like, that's... which is just faith.
Yeah, isn't it ironic that the people who start with belief, who emphasize belief in faith, say they know, and the people who are not supposed to know, scientists, the whole thing is question
Theory.
Everything, also like claim this sort of knowledge, but the point is you don't know. It's like you get close enough, and I think everybody's doing the same thing. You get close enough, either by just experience, observation, seeing the things that work. You get close enough to kind of get a sense of it, but never really get there. And one of the things that I really see in the world is that God works. So Durant, what's his first name? He wrote The History of the World, the Durant's History. So he wrote, I don't know how many volumes, and Will Durant, right? Attempted to write the history of the whole world, right? I've read a lot in it, but I've read the first couple books through, and he's talking about the Assyrians and the Babylonians and all these ancient cultures, and over again, here's a diehard atheist, and he says, when the people get too smart for their religion and they start to see their gods and explain them away, guess what happens? That civilization is doomed. Over and over again. As soon as they get too smart for their gods, they start like, wait a minute. Is the sun really a god, that comes up over the horizon? That's just, I don't know. That just seems, weird. It goes over and over and over again forever. It never varies, but this is a conscious being that's doing this. Like, they start to ask these funny questions, and then they think themselves out of it, and then their civilization goes to shit.
But I also
every
wonder,
single time. And we're talking, rinse and repeat over and over again.
I also wonder if part of that questioning creates a distortion, because it seems like inevitably we try to humanize God, and it just doesn't work that way. So at some point you're going to say, okay, I did this thing. I woke up every morning and talked to the sun, and he's, blessing me. The Lord Ra, I'm in his favor. And at some point you do the same thing and you don't get the same result. But that's not necessarily because there's something wrong with the God. It's because that you're trying to interact with it as you would another human being, and it's a totally different thing.
Yeah.
And my thing with this is, I do believe in love. And I believe in grace. And how I would explain either one of those things is there are moments where I behave in, like you were saying, an irrational way. I behave in a way that doesn't make sense because something deep in me is stirred in favor of a greater good. And so I don't, I'm actually here today from something like that. Like, I wanted to be asleep right now. There's no rational reason for me to be sitting here right now. But something deeper than my physiology and maybe even my psychology stirred me to be here. And I have that experience over and over again with my kids, where I absolutely do not have the resource to do one more thing, listen to one more word, and I want to throw someone across the room. And somehow,
keep doing it.
I sit there and I listen and I reflect loving kindness to this person. And so I've had enough of those experiences where I feel like there's something happening, and also experiences where I'm in a space of no solution, just absolute despair and hopelessness. And there's a experience that I have of really being honest with that hopelessness and softening into it and meeting it. And all of a sudden, a solution will come that almost feels like there's no way I could have thought of that. Where did that come from? That's not coming from any of my past experiences. So what made me think that this was a possibility? When I've been consciously thinking hard about this thing, possibly for weeks or months, and all of a sudden there's this thing that seems to fill the gap between my limitations and my possibilities.
Yeah, something a higher order of things, moving unknown. And Carl Jung called those synchronicities. It's like the synchronicities prove God. Was kind of the idea. Like, this is the universe winking at us going, oh, hey, guess what? You think you're all separate?
Actually.
But then there's the times when nothing works. And it seems like the thing should work, What's going on there? You don't know, right?
Yeah, and that's where I think we get into a distortion when we're trying to manage God. And I'm in a really interesting situation right now with my family where I have a very close loved one literally day to day on the brink of death. And my family is largely still really LDS, and there's something beautiful about their faith and their asks for prayers, and these specific things are what we need right now. And I absolutely do not believe that the number of temples that his name is on is going to affect whether he lives or dies. But what I observe is there is a field of energy that we're creating in the family with our attention and our care that's changing us in a way that we are going to be able to accept whatever happens better. And that's interesting to me.
Yeah.
And beautiful. Like I'm there with them every time there's a call for prayers, even though I don't orient myself to prayer in a way that I actually think it's going to change an outcome.
Yeah. This reminds me of Tim Minchin. Have you heard him? He has a song on God, Thank You, God. And he meets this guy and he's like, I believe in God because my mom's congregation prayed for her and her cataracts were healed. She was going blind and her cataracts were healed spontaneously. And she's like, thank you, God, for helping this one person while all these other people are starving.
Still have cataracts.
But there's this one person that this faith, it couldn't be anything else, of course. There's this one person, and that proves God, And the thing is, things do happen miraculously. Things happens for a reason we don't understand. And some of those feel synchronistic, but sometimes they don't happen. Sometimes I've prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed. I mean, I've spent all nights praying. I spent, I was trying to do who's the guy in the hunter in the Book of Mormon that prays all night?
Enos?
Thing, yeah. I tried to do the Enos thing where I was just like, I'm so faithful. I'm not going to sleep. I'm just going to pray. Guess what? It didn't work.
It worked for Mickey Singer, though. He's one of my favorite guys.
Yeah, well, there's
he had a breakthrough.
It comes. Things happen, and but they happen in their own time, and then we get to feel part of it somehow. Sometimes I don't know.
Yeah, so it's interesting to imagine, looking forward in the next couple of weeks with this family member, and what's the. Who's going to get credit if he survives and gets to keep his feet? And, these things that would actually be considered miracles at this point. And who's going to get credit if he doesn't?
Yeah. My mom would tell me that God is going to make her better and stuff. And then until he wasn't. And then she's like, well, I'm ready to die. I'm like, oh, well, okay, I guess God changed his mind.
Yeah. And so I have a bit of a hard time with the whole idea of being blessed and that kind of thing, because I think the part that people don't recognize, the shadow of that, is the people who don't get their way because they talked to God long enough, hard enough, made the right offering, whatever, are not blessed, are not favored by God. And that's pretty gross to me.
Yeah, I really struggle with that idea too. There's someone out there who just wasn't worth God's time, or who said the words in the wrong order or ate the wrong food on Sunday and so then didn't deserve the miraculous healing from cancer, but you did. Right.
Or the person who is in the exact same situation as this family member and doesn't have, 100 people praying for him every day.
Yeah. And it's
does he deserve to die more?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's been some interesting studies on prayer that it actually has an effect, but then they've tried to replicate them and they didn't work. And I honestly think it's the universe winking at us.
It's well, are you being genuine?
Had an 8%, better rate of recovery in one study, and then every time they try to recover, it doesn't work.
Yeah, but when you go back to the thing Heath was talking about, attention is powerful, and I think that's something we haven't really been able to learn how to measure very well scientifically. And my theory on that is that prayer is attention.
Yeah.
And attention with attention does have a force to it.
It does. Well, Dr. Bankston taking mice to the lab and curing breast cancer over and over and over again, is great, Same thing. He just believed that would happen and created a process that would happen with, and then it worked, scientifically, double blind. Mice given cancer, they should die, and they don't. Just through energy, just by him putting his hands on their cage and going, "I am doing energy."
Okay, then. Yes.
It's magic. Well, it's not. That's not exactly the method, but
it's something, right?
It is. Something's going on. There's a lot of things going on in, there's more things in heaven and earth ratio than could be dreamt of in your philosophy. I mean, we don't know so much.
Yeah. That's my favorite saying. I don't know what I don't know.
I don't know what I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think kind of tying that back into the science thing, you can pretty accurately predict certain things in this experience using statistics or whatever. And there's always outliers. There's always something that's going to be a little different, a little off. And it may not be discovered for a long time. And I think that's another part of what doesn't get taken into most equations is that there is some kind of living, evolving organism happening here that's always in change.
Mm-hmm.
There is always change happening that is shifting everything subtly, moment to moment.
So this brings me to where I'm at, right? Because I agree with a lot of what we're talking about. The idea that something is there, and it's obviously there because I can notice it. Like, even if I don't know how I'm noticing it in some way. Like Steve said, I exist, therefore God exists, right? Or I guess that's a very loose paraphrasing of what you said.
It works.
But it brings me to the question of like, okay, we've just spent 30 minutes talking about the undefinable, ineffable nature of the divine. And we're doing that in our archetype season. Mm-hmm. And archetypes are definitions of things. Mm-hmm. Right? So help me get from point A to point Q here. How are we doing this?
What does this have to do with archetype?
Because this is the archetype. Archetypes are the way that psychic energy or energy moves and is organized as structures in the subconscious. And in us, as Bono says in a U2 song, there is a God-shaped hole in my heart, he says.
Okay.
See, that God-shaped hole is something that we click into when we engage with what we call deity. And whether or not we're engaging with deity or each individual deity, it's the same idea. There's this specific general presence that has numinosity, and numinosity is what how we know there's an archetype. So the reason why there are similar types of gods that show up in all the pantheons, right? There's a Hermes in every pantheon. Hermes, Thoth, Jesus. There's a love goddess. And sometimes the love goddess is the war goddess. That's the same. That happens in several cultures. There are these fascinating, I think, truths that show up in the way that we decide to personify or understand the energy. And so God, in a way, is the archetype. Carl Jung said, for instance, the Christ archetype is the self. It's us trying to understand ourselves. Mm-hmm. So there's Christ. And for there to be Christ, there has to be Antichrist. Always. Mm-hmm. For Christ to go to heaven, he has to go through hell. Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting. For there to be a God, there has to be an anti-God. Or God himself being a total dick. Mm-hmm. As we meet in Job, right? Mm-hmm. Hey, look at that guy. He's doing everything right. Let's fuck with him.
Yeah.
Because Satan doesn't think I'm really good enough.
So you see, there's us in it, and you could say it's just us, but I don't get that. There's structure there that we didn't choose, and we ourselves are a pattern that we didn't choose. So who chose? Like I didn't choose some things about me, and if I could design myself, I might do a little edit on several factors.
Yeah, I edit some stuff.
Or if I really live it out, I think what I'd find is that I won't change a damn thing. Right? Mm-hmm. And God is good. Because we're here, we're doing it. And I wouldn't realize a lot of things if I didn't have the limitations I have. If I haven't been through the hells, I couldn't experience the heavens. So, my answer to Keith is so wide ranging that I can't really put it in any structure. But what I'm going to say is that there's numinosity, there's energy coming. There's a whole bunch of people who have imagined a God, and then this God has become extremely multifaceted, whether it's the one or the many. And that's worth paying attention to.
Yeah, and I think archetype like every deity is an archetype, and it is a way to approach the numinous. And I think one of the things that we as humans do is we try to understand or control that. And I think we'll have a better experience with that if we use it to understand ourselves better, instead of trying to somehow, control the vastness that life is. And we can use it to understand more of what we are.
Yeah.
And so using these deities is really fun and fascinating. I was reading a book called Awakening Shakti, and it goes through a bunch of the different Hindu goddesses, and read this whole story of Parvati and Shiva, and there were so many things in it that just made me laugh out loud because they were so congruent with my relationship with Steve. Just little oddities that like I never would have realized that that's what we were doing, right? And then I read this thing and it just made me laugh and laugh. And I think that's another thing, is it helps us see the patterns that are happening over and over and over again throughout humanity, while also there are these really exquisite individual expressions in each of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we keep coming back to this. It comes back to archetypes of those things that you just can't deny are there, and this God is one of those things that there will never be a purely atheistic consciousness. There will never be conscious beings who are purely atheistic. In fact, I love the atheists because almost they're the counterpoint to belief, and I think that's very valuable. Mm-hmm. I love listening to Minchkin or Gervais or some of these other comedians that take on some of the absurdities of belief.
Yeah,
it's really good for humanity, and even the very scientific people, which I think it's so obvious to me when you study quantum. The big joke on science is that when it really, really studied itself, it got itself into the mystery. and then the scientists that are trying to put the genie back into the bottle and say, well, no, quantum science is totally explainable and it runs by rational principles that you just don't understand, and blah 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 blah.
Oh, I love that. That doesn't sound hokey or religious at all. No, there are rational, real things that you just haven't reached the level of understanding yet. Like, really? Is that so?
Sounds a lot like God to me.
Come to my school.
Any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. I feel like you could substitute religion there and it's the same fucking thing. Like, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's also hilarious to read some books, in my study of health and consciousness and whatever, every once in a while I'll encounter a book by a hardcore atheist, science-oriented person, and they're so blown away that, like, indigenous people had truth.
Yeah.
It kind of grosses me out. But like Steve's saying, like, there's something important happening there, because indigenous people had a lot of truth, and also they had a lot of bullshit. And so there's like these things that are balancing out, like what's really happening here.
Well, it's fascinating. The botanist that goes to the jungle and experiences ayahuasca and is studying the culture's botany because he's trying to make the case that they should own their own land and that they should decolonize, But people are like, no, they don't run their own resources very well. And he's like, they run that better than you could ever imagine. And you ask them how they do it. How did they gain their botany knowledge? And they're like, the jungle told us.
The medicine stuff. Like,
the scientists are like, oh no, the jungle didn't tell you that. You must have studied it somehow. The fact that they for instance, they have this poison. He talks about this. There's a certain snake that has a certain amount of a certain poison, whatever.
Venom.
And it would stun monkeys, and so they could eat monkeys. Which sounds gross to me, but probably yummy for them. And, they're like, how did you know that this would stun the stun the monkeys. And they're like, the jungle told us. Oh, the snake venom thing. It looked like a snake. The plant looked like a snake. So we knew this was the thing. And it works.
Okay.
You know, just ayahuasca itself, right? For them to find the two plants that they would combine in certain ratio to get the effect of ayahuasca is impossible. You know, the guy goes through the chance that somebody would discover that is nil.
Yeah.
And you ask them how they got it. Well, jungle told us, right? There's more going on there. So he starts to try to he starts as a botanist, there must be a different way to understand things than science knows. Right. Because what they're doing, their knowledge of botany, how they grow their plants, how it's really harmonious and you know, sustainable, etc., and genius, they didn't come out through science. Mm-hmm. They came out through experiencing the jungle and living in harmony with it, and then something else, and then they call it their gods, right? They meet ayahuasca, they have this experience, they get all sorts of knowledge through this experience that turns out is actually helpful, useful, practical information. And he's like, well, I can't ignore that. So something we're doing in the science world is maybe a little skewed towards, you know, materialism. And so he spends the rest of his life finding it. It's a really great story, Cosmic Serpent, really, really wonderful. I love it when science and God meet each other and the different people, you know, psychology and religion or, you know, hard science and mysticism, you know, they meet. The guy who...
What's the plant medicine one?
It's called Plant Medicine.
No, that's not it. It's a little bit How to Change Your Mind.
Oh yeah,
that one's kind of like that too.
Yeah, I like that. Where like the studies, this wacky mushroom thing is actually helping people in these very specific ways because here's what it's doing psychologically. Now we can study that, right? But you didn't need that. You didn't need to know that. You know, the people who found this stuff and have been using it in their culture for aeons. You know, they just figured it out. Well, how did they figure it out?
I mean, how many people died to figure it out? Or is there something else?
That's probably true.
Is it trial and error? Like,
yeah, I just finished the book Breath, and it's really similar that way, where it's finding these, you know, primitive and indigenous cultures that had all of this knowledge about breathing and its health benefits and the way that you breathe and stuff that to us is still actually being kept hidden in our culture because of the whole medical industrial complex. They're not telling us that, like, if you actually tape your mouth shut at night, you're going to see these huge health benefits, and people in the world have known this for, you know, millennia.
Yeah, all sorts of ancient practice and traditional practice like that then, you know, because we bought into materialism, we bought away from any kind of revelation or, you know, intuitive process. We ignored all that intuitive, and anything intuitive then was evil, and we had to figure it out scientifically. It's definitely cutting, you know, cutting our noses off.
So bring me back, because following this path, I'm feeling like this is a new way of looking at the world, but it isn't necessarily a new way. Like, connect it for me. How is this the archetype of God? Because to me, it feels like science is trying to replace the archetype of God. Or if you don't want to go with science, like intuition versus
I think science
facts or proof or whatever, like that idea.
Yeah.
Like if you look at the ancient civilizations and the modern civilizations, that would be the big difference. That we now are putting our faith in this X science, and that has become the new God. And so then is that like, is the contra archetype of God science? Are they the same? And we're looking at it from a different perspective?
It's a really interesting question. And I would say that, you know, like I said, it's all God. Our ability to think about thinking is a big piece of what I feel is deity. But then we decide when we decide we are God, then that's a problem. Well, so for instance, we can think about the Earth as the Earth, and it's just this planet, and it's somehow rotating around the sun, and you know, this all got organized, it's natural, whatever. Or we can think of it as Gaia. And that this energy has not only does it have its own presence and type of consciousness, but it has its own will. In a way, there's a will in it, and that these forces that are Earth have some purpose and energy in relationship, and even to us, right?
Now, see, okay, we can get into the what the Earth is and all that kind of thing, but immediately when you said that, my thought went back to the last episode, and we talked about archetypes being lenses through which you perceive the world, right?
Right.
And so, if you are now describing the same ball of molten rock that's hurtling around the sun in two very different ways, to me you're using the archetype of science, planet revolves around the sun, and the archetype of, say, divinity and Gaia as a mother goddess being.
Well, the difference between science and like archetype is that in science we need to tear it apart to find it out. It's reductive, right? And when you look at it from an archetype, you understand that there's this structure that's already just there, that you're already operating in, and you just have a relationship with it.
Right. So, if I'm the hero, right, archetype, because this is an archetype, or the savior or whatever, I look at someone who is struggling as someone who needs my help. And then I look at that same person who's struggling from the archetype of, the guide, and it looks different, or from a different archetype entirely, right? And so if I look at the Earth from the archetype of whatever, right? To me, what we're talking about is two different archetypes that change our perspective on the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of funny because we kind of try to take on archetype from a scientific place. Like, here's this particular archetype, here's its characteristics, and it operates this way.
Yeah.
The funny thing about archetypes is they resist that even that categorization. We can notice them and speak them and label them, but we don't. That doesn't lead to an understanding of it. Archetypes are understood in relationship. Like so it moves the thing from a definition to a kind of a way of understanding myself and the world,
right?
In relationship, meaning that I'm not defining it and using it, right? I'm seeing it and gaining curiosity in how I'm relating to that energy because I can feel the power already in it.
So then looking at the person who needs help as someone weak and needs me to save them has to have me in it.
Yeah.
It's the relationship between them and I that is changed by the archetype.
Yeah. We kind of take the place of God when we think scientifically.
Yeah. That's what I'm getting at, right? Like, it feels like scientific thought might be a way of seeing things that I guess we could talk about it as shifting divinity to ourselves. Like, we take over the role of the divine.
Yeah.
And I mean, you look at it's history, text, fiction is all wrought with this warning of like, don't be God, right?
Yeah.
Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, right? Mm-hmm. Talking about like, when you use science to create to become God, this is dangerous territory.
Yeah. But it's also dangerous to take any archetypal energy and become it. And I think that's where we're moving into like this merging of like what we've all been talking about and what archetype is and how we work with archetype is. I can work with hero archetype energy, and I can work with, like you were saying, guide, and I can work with science energy. When I work with all three of those, and maybe even spend a little bit of time in their shoes, if you will, like bringing some identity with that. What happens then is, for me, when I'm actually confronted with a choice, I feel like now I have more capacity to be in responsiveness than reactivity. Like, I feel like I'm more at choice because now I'm looking at it from all of these different perspectives and feeling the different energies move through me. And it's like, in this situation, that person actually is a victim and they need to be rescued.
Right. So by looking at the lens through which you are looking, you're able to have more control.
Right. And if you can look through a variety of lenses, or if you will call upon a variety of archetype energies, then you get what I see is a bigger tool belt for responsiveness, instead of just getting played by the, animal instinct, or the idealism, or whatever it is that can kind of play us in those situations where we're confronted with a choice.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's so odd, the idea of belief and faith, because faith has curiosity in it. And so if, for instance, if somebody is doing science, they're really looking into things, and they don't think that they ever get there, I think we have better science. We have better understanding. We're less likely to act in ways that are inharmonious. But eventually we're going to grab that ring, so to speak. We're going to grab the power and then try to use it to our advantage in a way that takes us out of the harmony of things, that gets us out of. And so we get messed up. And the same thing happens in religion, where somebody thinks they know what God is. As soon as you get out of faith, in most religions, faith is way more important than knowledge.
Right.
And that's because if you stay in curiosity, you're in relationship. You're no longer, if you think the other person in your relationship, for instance, I've got you figured. I know exactly where you are.
You're
whatever.
wrong.
Yeah.
You're wrong.
Doesn't matter.
Right. It's a continual curiosity and a continual, almost like humility before the complexity of reality, that keeps us in harmony with it. Like, so as soon as I say, this is God, he looks like me, here's his rules, of course.
Mm-hmm.
The only book that he
this is the only thing
spoke into.
Yeah, you've kind of taken the archetype, and now you're on the wrong side of it, I think.
Where you're being played by it, right?
Yeah, and to me, the new, and Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, and Michael Mead, and other people talk about this, where to be in curiosity and relationship with each other is like true myth. It's how we are now relating from this place of relating. And I think the new religion, if we're going to keep believing in God and not being awful to each other or awful to the earth, or getting ourselves out of disharmony, the new religion is to not only bow before God, but bow before the gods. That's everybody, and experience their experience with some humility, rather than knowing what other people should do, helping each other come to meaning and to interact with whatever is better and not better, whatever is in a higher order than us, or the higher order generally, in a way that is truly faithful, full of faith, full of curiosity and not understanding and not definition. So
this might be a question for, a whole other episode, but if we're looking at, an organization or a culture that questions its own, how did you say it? That goes beyond its own gods is doomed to fail, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have historically in the West, we have this monotheistic, belief system based culture. There are so many cultures and countries even that are founded on Christianity or founded on Islam or whatever. And the trend being now the individual superseding truth, right? Like the idea of the personal truth to me is that it's that very thing, right? Like I might believe something about gender and you might believe something about gender, but real worship and real humility and real grace is allowing there to be room for both of our beliefs to be true, right? To me, that looks like a shifting of where we place the divine. Right now, the divine is in each and every single individual, and we worship the individual, and we worship not in a way of like glorifying one person, but instead in a way of putting people over what we've previously done, which is the truth, right? Like we believe we know the truth. I know the true God and blah, 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 or I know the true scientific principle, and that's the most important thing in the world. And to me, the positive or optimistic side of me says, well, we're looking now at the individual as being more valuable than the truth. Sometimes I don't know if that's accurate or not. That's my question. Is that where we're headed? Is that the new archetype of the divine? Like, you know, this thing of this looking with compassion, or is it old? I don't know.
Yeah, Alan Watts has this really great thing that I have found exquisitely helpful, where he says he got to a point in his life where every time he met someone, no matter what they were doing, you know, how they were acting, whatever, and he would say, Shiva, oh Shiva, what a delightful disguise you have on today. And that's an interesting, you know, way to choose to relate to the individual. And there is kind of a bringing in of divinity into every individual that seems to be more towards harmony than our previous kind of dogmatic, somebody's going to tell us what's right,
dominance approach,
and we're going to try to get as many people as we can do it, and the people that don't are just not as significant.
Yeah, I mean, we've had the approach of the othering and the dominance, and I would say, you know, even being a man, the patriarchal approach to things of, you know, find the answer, make everyone believe the answer, and then do that thing, to the more inclusive matriarchal approach of, you know, bringing everything into the family, into the circle, into the community. So, I mean, that's sort of the shift that I'm maybe observing or feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, life is already living itself, and I've got to believe, you know, even though we say it's an individual myth, right? And Joseph Campbell will do a hero's journey one, but he talks about how lonely it is. That there's no longer a shared myth. That we each have to be the hero rather than a hero in a generation.
Yeah.
And we each have to trot this path. It's a hell of a path. Literally.
That's true. And
literally, figuratively, it's a hell of a path.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really this new thing and idea, and maybe not new, but I think really important, and that is each individual, in a way, the oldest idea, each individual, as they find their own truth, their own set of archetype and truth and relationship to God, whatever that is, and that will sync up, because life is living itself, and that will either create a counterpoint or a harmony. All those things are welcome to what's happening, and that will start to live more in harmony with nature, for instance. If I find my nature, if I really look inside and figure out what God is doing with this, and other people are doing that same question, you know.
Yeah, and if we believe God being the central consciousness, we're all going to be moving towards a point.
Yeah, and in that, there's some rough stuff, you know. When I meet somebody who's acting in a way that I don't like, and I can meet them as God in their own way, and then I could say, you know, thank you for the seeing, thank you for the experience. That's really a big deal, you know. But there's a harmony here, but that harmony does experience itself in duality. You know, there's a singularity. I believe in non-duality. I believe that's the nature of things. But duality is the only way to get to non-duality. That's the funny irony, you know. And the irony is the more I concentrate myself as an individual rather than separate myself, you know, Carl Jung uses the term individuate. The more I find the parts of myself and live them as me consciously, right? And not unconsciously where they're kind of playing me. I get to play them because now I'm conscious of those processes. The more I live in harmony with those around me, the more I build, it's not like, I'm going to be my individual self and fuck all you people,
Yeah.
That never happens when you're on the true individuation path. It never happens. You always find harmony here reflects out there in harmony. Like that's, I think, a certain kind of faith. I have a certain kind of faith in that. Mm-hmm. All I know is I'm not smart enough to run the fucking world and tell everybody what to do. And I distrust those people who are, and we're finding out that those people who have done that have been wrong.
Yeah.
So often and led to horrible and wide scale, distortions that have they're causing hell. They're causing an environmental crisis. That are causing a social crisis. That have not seen so many people who are living it differently, and experiencing it differently. So yeah, I feel like we're there. That's the thing. Individual to create the collective.
Yeah, this is a place where however, you or I previously held the idea of the body of Christ. Like, I find that imagery helpful. Yeah. With this is that, like, a brain cell is not necessarily going to understand or see things the same way that a toenail cell is. But if they're each being their own thing, then the body's going to work better. If either one of them is either trying to be the other thing or annihilate the other thing, the body's not going to work as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you for listening to this podcast on what is God. And, we take on just these tiny little topics that are easily digested in an hour. No problem, right? This is one that can go on. And hopefully this, these musings, these ideas have been helpful for you today. And if they are, please pass this on. Maybe these are thoughts and maybe you hate them, maybe you love them. I don't care. Maybe either way they're helpful. So enjoy. Listen to the whole podcast. Go back and find some of the other pieces. If this is the first one you found, go find some of the other pieces that maybe we'll put this in context for you as well, in this continuing conversation. And blessings to you.